Welcome everyone to Male Fuzz TV. I am Peter and today I'm going to be talking about Ripley episode 8, season 1 episode 8, since there could be more seasons as I now understand. It is the finale of the season and it is called Narcissus. So spoilers for the episode as always. This is a Patreon sponsored review, so thanks to Fletcher for picking the show. So yeah, this is a bigger episode. It was like 75 minutes give or take. Had a bit more meat packed into it. And it wraps up all of the loose ends that we pretty much had throughout the show, and kind of get, the ending is pretty much perfect in terms of like the final moment. It's kind of the moment that I think most of the audience that are watching the show be waiting for, is that because I kept saying over and over again over the last like 3 or 4 episodes, all it takes for Ripley's entire lie, that his web of lies, to fall apart, is someone pointing out like what Dickie actually looks like to the inspector, and ultimately that's the final moment of the show. Is him getting the book that Marge has written, and there's a dedication to Dickie and a photograph of him, and of course he looks at it and his face drops, and that moment is extremely satisfying. It's been building to that for so long. Obviously, there's a lot more going on in this episode, but it's hard not to just kind of start with the ending. I think what's interesting about how all this wraps up is that Ripley effectively gets away with everything. It's actually tied in a much neater bow than I think even he could have like predicted. And I think there's like some of it he clearly intentionally tried to do and was actually being quite smart, such as the letter he wrote the landlady, kind of indicating that Dickie's probably going to commit suicide, and kind of like almost wrapping up the case for everyone because everyone believes that he's just dead and therefore and also guilty of Mayle's murder. But then there's also a lot of stuff in this episode where he's thinking on his feet and he's considering doing stuff. Marge almost dies in this episode at least twice, and he's very, and it's interesting that both occasions he's almost going to do it for different reasons. One of them is just out of because the second time it's out of like almost necessity, because it's like she's figured it out, or in the moment he thinks she's figured it out. She's not. It swerves at the last possible second, but for a moment it looks like she's starting to put 2 and 2 together, and he's getting ready to kill her in the exact same way that he did Miles with the ashtray. He's got it in his hand, he's walking towards her, big tense moment, and then it all deflates when she says something that she is interpreting what she's discovered in a much more innocent way than what Ripley was thinking, and in terms of what actually happened. But the first time he almost kills her, where he just kind of gets the ID and looks at her and imagines what his excuse is going to be, like, oh, she slipped into the water in Venice, and it was set up earlier on with the slippery moss on the step. Like, that moment is more just out of, I don't know who he is, I guess, like, and how much he dislikes Marge, how much he wants to be rid of her. It does kind of bring this idea that everyone else he's killed throughout this season, and that's basically just Dickie and Miles, is that it was always kind of out of a goal, right? It always served a purpose. The second one was survival, because Miles was going to ruin everything he'd done, and the first was Dickie, which was definitely malicious, but it was a means to an end, I guess, in a lot of ways. Although I would, if you analyze the character, I would argue that yes, he is obviously got a lot of personal attachment to Dickie and the obsession. There's a lot of other things going on there. It's not like a completely cold thing. There is kind of a passionate element to it in some sense. But this moment with Marge, where he's thinking about killing her and then decides not to, that moment does kind of feel like he's considering it just because he wants to. And that's a little bit different than the others. And I think that's partly just been emboldened by the fact that he's done it twice now and pretty much gotten away with it. And that's given him this sense that he can keep getting away with it, right? That's something that killers sometimes go through, is that once they get away with it once, it's like, well, I can just do this as much as I want. No one will stop me. So there's a little bit of that in there, which is interesting. What was fun for me, not knowing how this was going to end, because as much as I knew there's a possibility of more seasons and there's more books to base stories off of, that didn't necessarily mean that he was going to completely win by the end. Like, he could have been found out by everyone and just manage to get away, right? And go off somewhere else, new identity, away from all these characters, but they've all figured out what he'd done by the end, right? I thought that was a possibility. And the fun stuff with this Marge, like, will he, won't he kill her, was that I genuinely kept thinking that he's going to regret not killing her because she's going to unravel it, that she's the one who's going to take it all apart. Because, they kept teasing that he has Dickie's suitcase under his bed. Marge eventually finds Dickie's ring, which is what causes the confrontation where he almost kills her the second time. All these moments, but even just as soon as Marge shows up, there's really this kind of air to her where, is she here to like snoop? Is she here to try and figure things out? The way she kind of like passively aggressively accepts the invitation to stay at his fancy new place, and then he doesn't want to leave her there on her own, but he has to ultimately because she doesn't want to go and see Dickie's father, who's in Italy. And she ends up being there or not. Now, she ends up not snooping during that scene. She actually goes snooping innocently because she's looking for a needle and thread later. She never actually does the snooping that I think he's suspicious that she's going to do. And I think by extension that we, the audience, think she's probably going to do. She actually never does anything like that as far as we know. So I think it's interesting in terms of like having the audience kind of like in the headspace of the main character. And I think we're thinking in the same paranoid way that he does, where he's suspecting everyone as being just as devious and scummy as he is. But Marge isn't that, right? Yeah, she can be, like she has a bit of an attitude at times, sure, but she's not a bad person. She's not going to go rummaging through his things and try to prove that he's done something. And yeah, by the end of the episode, like not only is there now a complete cover story to Dickie's disappearance, like even Dickie's father is like, oh, I'm sorry I ever doubted you, Ripley, you're a great young man, and keep the ring because Dickie gave it to you for a reason. Because ultimately Marge, her analysis of why Dickie gave the ring to Ripley is not to jump to Ripley did something bad and took it from him. It's that, oh no, he didn't think he was coming back, so he gave this ring to him because he knew he was going to kill himself. And that's kind of where we spiral for the rest of the episode. That's what the story ends up being. And even the PI from the first episode is back. And yeah, like, again, Ripley's nervous. Ripley thinks that this PI is going to, like, suss it out of him. He imagines a different version of the interrogation. And the PI interrogates him the exact same way as Inspector Ravini. In fact, there's another Ravini interview in this episode as well, which I'll get to. It already happened by this point, but I'm not going in order. I'm talking about the interesting things. There's a lot going on in this episode. It's 75 goddamn minutes, but he sits there and imagines that the PI is like, I know you killed him. I know you killed Miles too. Yeah, it's all you. But instead, he just asks him, what do you think of Dickie? What's your personal opinion of who he was? And Ripley goes on this journey talking about him, and it marries up to what he said to Ravini in the earlier scene, which is that Dickie, like, and the scene with Ravini is a lot more kind of like just refusing to say it and kind of like leading the inspector to get to the point of it, which is the suggestion that Dickie was gay with Miles and that the murder was some sort of lover's spat or lover's revenge, and that the suicide is probably because he was secretly gay and didn't want people to find out, and two, was obviously guilty from the murder he had supposedly done. And this is kind of what Ripley kind of gets to throughout this conversation as well. Now, I want to make it clear, he doesn't necessarily say all of these things. A lot of it, he gives just enough of an implication so that the PI says some of these things, and then Ripley kind of like reluctantly agrees as if it's hard for him to admit these things. Although he does specifically say that Dickie was in love with him. And this has been a theme throughout the show, this idea of Dickie thinking Ripley might be gay, his attitude towards seeing some gay people on the beach, and then kind of like this, like, what was the relationship with Miles? All this stuff there's definitely kind of a lot of kind of homophobia kind of running through a lot of like how certain people are viewed in this show, and then how it's been sort of flipped back on itself. And in some level, I do wonder if Ripley is taking some pleasure in on using that as the kind of the subversion of subverting how Dickie actually felt about that subject back onto him now after death. I wonder if there's some level of satisfaction there. In fact, I wonder. I mean, this is an old story. It's an old book. I do wonder if part of the whole subtext of it is kind of this idea that someone who is gay in older time periods, especially, has to hide who they are and not reveal it. And that's kind of what Ripley's sort of hiding his identities and having to sneak around and do all these other. I wonder if, like, it didn't really click for me until this episode that the entire thing may actually be kind of something of an analogy for that, especially in times gone by. This idea of being in the closet, because there's a couple of hints here or there that Ripley might be gay, and it doesn't really quite come up, directly. It doesn't come out in the open, but here he uses it. In fact, he even says that when Dickie confessed his love to him, that Ripley said awful things. He said he disgusted him and told him to get lost. And I think what I liked about that is not only how it adds to this idea of subverting kind of how the feeling was kind of the opposite. Not that Ripley was necessarily in love with Dickie romantically, although it's possible he might have been to some extent. It was more of an infatuation and an obsession in other ways. But the idea that it's kind of flipped in this sense, I like that thematically for what's going on. But the other thing I like about it is that it lets him bring out a little bit of truth, right? In the sense that when he talks about his final interaction with Dickie, when the PI is asking him, he says that he hurt him. He says that he was cruel and he wishes he hadn't. And it feels like as he says that, he's thinking about killing him. And it actually gives these words a little bit of truth, because there is some kind of like guilt there. There is some emotional resonance to that final interaction, even though it's not exactly what he's saying it is. That feeling that he's talking about in the final interaction is somewhat true to an extent, and it feels like he's actually, like, that's what makes it convincing, I think, to the PI, is that slither of truth in the emotion makes it convincing in the context of everything else that he's saying. So yeah, that ends up being the story, is that Dickie was going to North Africa because that's what he'd asked for, the boat schedule. That's what Ripley asked for when he was pretending to be Dickie, and he never made it there. So the summarization from everyone is that he seemingly had killed himself on that boat trip. He never made it to Africa. So yeah, and everything's neatly wrapped up, and Dickie's father's even like, hey, take the ring. He gave it to you. That means it meant something, to him, and to you meant something to him. So take the ring. And even Marge gets an awkward goodbye where she's going back to the US. She's finally leaving Italy. People are moving on from things. The whole thing. Yeah, all of this was pretty satisfying. Seeing it all come together was good stuff. And then, like I said, the satisfaction of seeing Inspector Ravini's reaction to this all was kind of great. Admittedly, part of me did want to see Marge's reaction to some of it, and they kind of teased us that a little bit throughout the episode, but I get why. I get why it's neat to do it this way. And who knows, like maybe off camera, like Ravini starts calling everyone, trying to track down this elusive Tom Ripley now, which is a good segue to go back and talk about what happens with Ravini in this episode. So obviously Ripley has come to Venice. I was wondering how he had all the money to rent this big fancy place with a butler and stuff, but it does get clarified later on that Dickie, quote unquote, cashed in a bunch of traveler's checks or something right before he left. So okay, all right, he cashed out about as much money as he could, basically. But once he reads in the paper, right, that Inspector Ravini is looking for a missing Tom Ripley, Ripley goes to the local police station in Venice and says, hey, I'm Tom Ripley. This newspaper says I'm missing. I'm here. And of course, Ravini gets called, and Ravini says, I'm coming to Venice. I'm going to talk to him tonight. This is the thing, I had no idea how close Venom and Rome are. Like, I didn't realize that he could get there in the span of the day, but it turns out he could. So, very nice. Which, by the way, the location shooting here for this is absolutely gorgeous. I assume they were shooting just on location, at the very least for some of the exteriors where you're actually seeing the water. I can't imagine, I think the money to fake that would have been way more than just shooting in the location. So It looks great. I mean, obviously this show's had a lot of great locations. It's really made use of Italy. It's kind of one of the big signatures of the show, is getting to see all these places in this pretty gorgeous black and white photography. But anyway, so Ravini's coming, and part of me was thinking, oh, like, was he hoping that he would just phone Ravini, say Ripley's here, and that'd be the end of it? But no, Ravini's like, oh, I'm coming there to talk to him. I'm coming right now. I'll be there tonight, and he leaves immediately. And I'm like, okay, what's he going to do? How's he going to get out of this? This is he's put himself in a corner here. And I think what I really appreciated about this, and it's not so much that I think it's completely convincing, like, I think there's a little bit of suspension of disbelief and believing that this inspector doesn't just recognize him as the same man that he spoke to when he said he was Dickie. But I do appreciate that it wasn't just a wig, it wasn't just like a fake beard. It was also something as simple as making sure the light bulb that was near him where he was going to be sitting was much dimmer than it normally would be. He goes out and gets a low wattage bulb so that he can be a little bit more in the dark. Just, not enough to be suspicious, but just something that's a little bit less illuminating, I guess. And sits intentionally far away from the inspector. Like, he's doing every little thing he can to try and obscure the fact that he's the same person. If anything, he could have done with maybe switching up his speech patterns a little bit as well, because I thought some of that was but it's the same, same type of ashtray. He's went out and bought the same ashtray. He's bought a new set of pajamas, which we even get, like, I'm going to call it the Spider-Man no home shot, when he throws out the pajamas he picked out back in episode 1. He goes to like a bin and throws them in, and he walks away, and it's exactly the same shot as when Spider-Man throws out his outfit and walks down the alleyway, and you can see the outfit hanging out of the trash in the foreground. That made me smile, because it was such a specific reference it conjures them. I'm not saying it's an intentional reference. I totally buy they just did this like on their own without even thinking of that, but it's immediately what my mind went to. Maybe because I'm a nerd, and that's fine. But yeah, so he's kind of like built this new lavish lifestyle for himself here, and he's using Tom Ripley as his own name. So yeah, I already kind of went into a little bit of where the conversation goes here, but he as he does, pretends to be helpful and try to offer up any information he can. But Ravini is kind of the one that gets to the suggestion that, I think Ripley says something to the effect of, oh, he never talked to me about his, romantic life or something like that. And then the inspector kind of finishes that thought and sort of suggests that Miles and Dickie might have been involved with each other. And, it kind of goes down that path from there. It's a very interesting scene. Obviously, it's directed very well, as all these interview type scenes have been throughout the show. And we get 2 of them in this episode between this character and the PI later. But it works surprisingly well. This kind of emboldens him. And it's after this where Marge phones and ends up, she's already in it. She's already in Rome even. And at this point, she's already started to capitalize on kind of the fame of being associated with Dickie, who's now this murderer in the newspapers. She kind of catches a photographer taking photos of her, and after a couple of seconds of like being uncomfortable, she starts kind of posing for them and realizes there's an opportunity here. So she actually sells a photograph to some magazines, which helps her finish her book, seemingly, because she's done that by the end of the episode. And she's getting something out of this. But a lot of her exchanges with Ripley, as much as it goes to, obviously where it does by the time all the lies are really coming together by the end, and the letter to the landlady, which sounded like he was about to commit suicide, was kind of the linchpin. And that's the part that made me say, oh, some of this is actually his intentional genius. That letter was a very, very shrewd move. The way he worded it, the way he kind of said, oh, I'm not going to need these things, I'm not coming back, but you've been kind to me and I'm thankful for that. Like, there was a lot of things in that letter that was very good suggestive stuff, that it does feel like there was a bit of a master plan here, even though there was like these risks along the way. And there was, again, it feels like every time he's got a plan, like, at any point, one of those threads could be pulled and the whole thing will unravel. It doesn't quite do that, but there is a lot of that passive-aggressive tension. Like, it does feel like Marge is trying to be nicer than she has been in the past, but there's still these little moments. For example, when they're talking about Dickie's father, Marge says, yeah, he doesn't like you. He thinks you took advantage of him and Dickie. And Ripley says, I never took anything from Dickie. And there's just an awkward pause after he says that, because we know Marge thinks that. Marge described Ripley an episode or two ago as a leech, as someone who's just there to leech off of Dickie and just take. We know her opinion of him. So that awkward moment after he says that is beautiful, right? It's so rich with like just tension, because we know exactly how these two characters are, how they feel. I think there's a real talent in TV and writing and directing and acting even, but when you get to this point where two characters are so well established that you can have this really complex chemistry between them, where one of them is a lying cheat, a con man. The other one has been suspecting that character of being that the entire time. But they're in this context right now where they're keeping up appearances to each other, even though she knows what he just said was bullshit. He knows what he just said was bullshit. He maybe even suspects that she thinks it's bullshit, but in the off chance that she can never prove it or like kind of like solidify it any more than she already has, he's going to keep up the appearances, right? And then the impossible might happen, which is completely turning the tide. And he kind of does that by the end of this. And he almost, doesn't by killing her a couple of times. And that's what I was saying when I was like, oh, I almost thought that he was going to like get caught out. And the irony of the final episode would be that had he just killed Marge in the two times where he had a chance to, he would have gotten away with it. Right? He would have, like, that she was going to end up unraveling everything, but because he left her alive, she was able to still do that. Now, that's obviously not where it went, but that was part of the fun of watching all this stuff play out, of him taking her home when she was drunk, and, like, getting annoyed because she kept calling him Tommy, and she wouldn't, like, climb over the fence to go around the front to get, go in the other door, so he had to do it himself, and just all these little beats of her getting on his nerves, and whether or not she's intentionally doing that, or this is just like we're perceiving it through his perspective, so we're kind of feeling what he's feeling a lot of the way. It's especially interesting when he's talking to Dickie's dad afterwards, and he says that he doesn't like Marge and thinks, oh, she can be a bit much, and he's like, she can be, but I like her. She's not like. It's interesting to see him kind of like, it's in his interest almost to always kind of play everything off that everyone's friends, to keep everything kind of feeling like the vibes are good, because if he starts badmouthing Marge, it might make him look like he's someone who turns on people or badmouths people. So the nice guy persona that he's trying so hard to cultivate as Tom Ripley, it has to be maintained, even when the other characters starting to go down this path. And one of the things that he kind of does to, keep the lie going and reinforce to Marge that he does care about Dickie and to not suspect him of anything, even though the reason for this is more that he's getting uncomfortable because people are joking about who could be responsible. But one of the plot threads in this episode is that the party they go to, but also a party that he goes to a little bit before she shows up in the episode, is basically just rich, bored people invite him to these, like, parties because they want to talk to him about knowing the murderer, because once he's been found publicly and he's not a missing man anymore, people want to meet him and talk to him about Dickie because Dickie killed someone. And they're making these sort of, like, theories and accusations, and it's kind of making him, uncomfortable. Not necessarily because he feels guilty or because they're getting close to any kind of truth. I mean, one guy gets kind of suspiciously close and then just sort of laughs it off because he's joking. But it's more this idea that he realizes that he's there for their entertainment, right? They're entertaining themselves by talking to him because he's got an interesting connection and story to bring up. And I think that genuinely does bother him. I do think it does. Even though he spins it when he's saying to Marge, let's go home, he says it's, oh no, they're disrespecting Dickie. This is just entertainment to them, and I won't disrespect him like that. I don't think he cares because they're disrespecting Dickie. I think he cares because like he's come here thinking, oh, am I part of this high society now? They've invited me here. Does that mean I'm important? But he's just there to, be the showpiece of the party, to be the one that can talk about this big thing that's went down, because they're all bored rich people. So I thought that was an interesting little theme that was played throughout, which I guess naturally leads me to the kind of the big guest star that popped up in this episode. John Malkovich appeared at the first party, and it's funny that very quickly it becomes apparent that his character Reeves Minot, or Reeves Minot, maybe how that was pronounced. I can't remember how he said it. But when he shows up, the way he tackles the question, well, even just the way he starts talking to Ripley had a kind of an air about it. But as soon as Ripley says, what do you do for profession? The way he goes, that's a good question. What do I do for profession? And the way he kind of ponders it and then sort of settles on art dealer and kind of smiles as he says it. And then Ripley says, yeah, I'm an art dealer too. And he's like, yeah, I could tell. I can always tell. He's like, yeah, so can I. I think it's very implicit, even before you see all the different business cards with all the different names and numbers on them, and different locations and numbers, I think it was. I think it's pretty clear that John Malkovich's character is basically another Ripley. Now, before anyone goes typing in the comments, I actually had a little spark here as well, where I went, I'm pretty sure he's got something to do with Ripley, like in terms of like past projects. And I looked it up, and yeah, he played Ripley in a Ripley movie. Not Talented Mr. Ripley, that was Matt Damon. I think it was called Ripley's Game, which was a little bit later, based on one of the other books. And I don't know why I knew that, right? I couldn't have told you for sure that, but there was like a spark in my head. Clearly I'd heard of this at some point, but it felt like a sort of legacy casting thing where, oh, this is like a passing of the baton or something from an old Ripley, or, obviously he's not actually playing Ripley in the show, but it is kind of perfect that if you know him as someone who's played Ripley, that he's playing some kind of elder version of a Ripley type character in this show. And he basically says, hey, give me a call if you ever want to, I can't even remember what he says, compare notes or do something together. But it's very clear he's someone who, like Ripley, is grifting, he's a con man, he's mooching off these rich people, and part of that is having to come to this dumb, boring party and mingle. And we see him again at the end of the episode. He gives Ripley a very good counterfeit passport. And this is a passport that Ripley uses to accept a package under this name, which turns out to be that Picasso painting that he took from Dickie's place. So as we get towards the end of the episode, he's sitting there and he's looking at the painting, and it starts intercutting back to the period piece flashback, which I've not even mentioned. Yeah, the opening of the episode is Caravaggio, on the run for murder and sitting drinking with his bloody knife. And it kind of like sort of, contrast between them, which also reminds me actually of another little moment, which was quite good, is when Marge first shows up. Ripley, when he was out doing his like little montage of setting up his new life and getting his new pajamas, one of the things that he bought was a book of Caravaggio paintings, and he's been looking through it, and that's how he's even looking at that when he gets the idea for the light to be controlled to try and help disguise who he is. He remembers the priest saying that about the Caravaggio painting back in like episode 4 or 5 or whatever it was. Marge spills wine on the book, and Ripley like goes to get it really frantically and starts wiping it off, and he says it's okay, it's just the book. But of course he's wiping at this book. It means a lot to him. It's very symbolic for where he's gotten to and everything that's going on. And even though it's in black and white, I couldn't help but get the vibe that this is clearly red wine, and that this is like him wiping blood off of the paintings, right? And you can see like blood on the face of like one of the paintings, and he's wiping it off, and it's there's definitely kind of a symbolic idea of like wiping his bloody work clean, if you will, in there. And again, this is one of those moments where I'm like, what's Marge thinking? Is she like paying attention? Did she notice who that book was about? Is she noticing like things that he's doing? And you really like are suspecting that she is, up to something, and not in a bad way. She like if she's trying to prove or figure out if Ripley's guilty of killing Dickie, then she's definitely the good character in the story by doing so. But we're watching from the perspective of Ripley, so we don't know what she's up to. We don't know what she's trying to do. And that was part of the fun for a big chunk of this episode. Because the episode does neatly kind of break into kind of these segments. It's like setting up Ripley's new life in Venice. It's then the Ravini kind of sort of clearing up the stuff with the police. And then it's the Marge sort of segment. And then it's, okay, Ripley speaks to Dickie's dad and then brings all that other, like, you know, Marge is there as well at that point, obviously still, but like all of that stuff comes together. It really does break down into sort of like 3 or 4 very distinct segments of the episode. It is very good. Like, I don't know if I've said that yet, but it's a very good episode. I don't think it's my favorite by any means. I still think episode 3 and 5 is probably my favorite overall. I think if I was to pick one, it's just so laser focused, and while the one in the boat is excellent as well, I do think just the build up to the killing of Miles or Freddy, whatever you want to call him, and then I think the reason why Miles is sticking in my head more is because I kept noticing the way that Ravini said it. He kept saying malaise instead of Miles, but everything in that episode was so focused. But this is probably the 3rd best episode, and it's a very satisfying conclusion to everything that's come up until now. It has all the solid direction, all that emphasis on those little quiet moments or details that have been so, you know, emblematic of this entire show. It's a good, funny conclusion as well. That moment where Ravini sees the photograph at the end is legitimately funny, and you kind of like take a bit of pleasure that Ripley got away with it, even though he's a flawed character, obviously, because he's an anti-hero. He's not a good guy, but I think it's very entertaining. You know, and yeah, the police bit, you know, there's like a whole, I'm not going to get into it too much, but there's a whole like sub part of that where Ravini's chastising the local detective for Dickie, quote unquote, disappearing, and this local detective being mad that he has to go and like find out where Dickie went, and he goes back to that concierge and talk to him, and it feels like Ravini, whenever he's on the phone to him, is kind of criticizing him for his lack of detective work and like enthusiasm. And he just wants to be done and eat his croissant or whatever he's eating. It's like he wants to be just done with it. But there's a whole scene with the concierge is like, yeah, he seemed a bit depressed. And that concierge, I'm sure there's some like symbolism in the concierge being really pissed anytime that someone moves his little Jesus figure across his desk, because the detective moves it to put his hat down. And the camera focused on it as well last episode. And I do wonder if there's some symbolism there that I'm not quite getting. It's entirely possible. I'm sure there's some other elements that I'm not picking up on when it comes to that stuff. But it certainly was a memorable interaction. Even if I didn't get all of the subtext of that element of it, even just this sort of like passive aggressive like attitude that these two had to each other, because he didn't really want to be talking to the police. This detective thought this concierge was taking too much time and fancying himself a bit of a psychologist, as he put it. All of that was just like entertaining, if nothing else. But that was all in the lead up to before Ripley just turns himself in and says, "Hey, I'm Ripley. I'm not missing. Also not dead." Funnily enough. I think if you've got a critique about the episode, by and large, it's probably just the suspension of disbelief that Inspector Ravini, who seemingly is a good detective, did not notice that it was Ripley in disguise, or it was the man he thought was Dickie in disguise as Ripley, to be, I suppose, accurate about that. So, you know, I like if that's a problem, I can kind of get it. I think because it wasn't just a disguise, I'm willing to accept it as kind of like an assembly of the parts that it is, rather than whether or not I think it would actually be convincing in real life, but more just that it gave me enough parts to sort of suspend the disbelief, and kind of, you know, and the fact that the motivation for the light stuff was from the book, and it felt thought out and inside the context of the show. So I was okay with that. But yeah, super satisfying as a conclusion. I would be definitely interested in more of it if they do end up doing a second season at some point, when both Andrew Scott and Zalian want to come back. Zalian being the writer director of the show. Especially since you've set up John Malkovich, who I presume is set up here because they would want to do more with him as a more prominent character in a potential second season. And I do wonder as well, like, do they have to like do the second book next, or is it kind of open? Because I highly doubt they're going to do enough seasons to do every book. So I wonder if like you like, because this felt all very wrapped up by the end. I wonder if they can just pick whatever the next best one is rather than having to do the second. Because I don't see any world when this gets to, I think there's 6 or 7 books. I don't see it getting to 6 or 7 seasons, but I could see 3 seasons. So maybe just picking the best 3 stories. Maybe you could even incorporate some little details of some of the other ones in if it's possible. But yes, no, it was very good. So that is my thoughts on the Ripley finale. It was an excellent show. I'm sure there's some stuff I didn't mention because, like I said, it was a long, beefy episode, but it was full of tense moments, funny moments, great cinematography, all the things that the show has kind of sort of built up and I've come to expect from it at this point. So thank you very much for joining me. You can support all the content and help keep all the reviews coming over at patreon.com/MailFuzzTV or via YouTube membership if that's more your thing. Although in Patreon, you'll also get all the bonus stuff for the movie channel and check out all the movie podcasts over there if you haven't ventured over to MailFuzz Movies as of yet. But there's 3 movie podcasts that post regularly over there and you might be interested in them. So thank you very much for joining me. I do appreciate it. Keep watching TV. Have you got any vanilla?